Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of interviews presented by the Civic Caucus entitled Restoring Trust in Minnesota's Civic Institutions. I am Paul Ostrow, board member of the Civic Caucus, and I'm honored to serve as the moderator of these important discussions. Joining me tonight are Executive Director Janis Clay and Luka Krohn, our digital and web services consultant. Janis is a founding member of the Civic Caucus, a licensed attorney, and a veteran of Minnesota public policy debates. Janis has ably led our organization as we adapt to the quickly changing public policy and social media landscape. Luka is a first-year student at the University of Pennsylvania. Over the past several years, Luka has worked with the Civic Caucus with our interviews and articles and reports, and much of his work can be seen on our website, www.civiccaucus.org. Before we dive into the first interview in our series, we want to share with you our excitement about our new intergenerational interview panels. Each of our interviews will pair two policy veterans with two future leaders. At the Civic Caucus, we believe in the marketplace of ideas. We also believe that we must nurture a love of good public policy in a younger generation that has seen far too little of the nonpartisan problem solving that was once the hallmark of Minnesota. If you are joining us live, thank you. If you have questions to raise with our guests or comments you wish to share, please add them to the chat, and I will do my level best to raise those questions with our guests towards the end of our interview. You may also be watching this interview on our YouTube channel or on other platforms at a later date. Please share with your friends who you know like a good public policy discussion. And if you like what you see, please join us again for our upcoming interviews with Peter Hutchinson on May 27, Mitch Pearlstein and Dane Smith on June 13, and with T. Williams, who's also one of our panelists, later on this summer. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guests who will address our topic for tonight: better policing through leadership, accountability, and partnership. Lucy Gerold served in many capacities in her 34 years with the Minneapolis Police Department, rising to positions as precinct commander and deputy chief of police. Lucy implemented successful strategies in community policing and was known for her collaborative leadership style and her success in crime reduction. Lucy has also served as the executive director of the Jeremiah program and is a moderator with Braver Angels, a grassroots effort to depolarize America. Thank you, Lucy, for joining us tonight. John Delmonico served 37 years with the Minneapolis Police Department, rising to the position of lieutenant on the North Side. John served as president of the Minneapolis Police Officers Federation from 1999 to 2015. As Federation president, John advocated for law enforcement while seeking common ground with management and with elected officials. John has also served as a peer counselor and as a member of the faculty at Metropolitan State University. John, thank you also for joining us. Along with Janis and Luka, our interview panel tonight will also include T. Williams and Chloe Zhao. T has a storied career in public service, which includes his service as the executive director of the Phyllis Wheatley Community Center, Minnesota's first correctional ombudsman, and as a member of the Minneapolis School Board. T's book, Rewind, the compelling story of lessons learned from his leadership in the creation of the Urban Coalition, a remarkable collaboration formed in Minneapolis in 1968 to address issues of race and poverty, was published just today. Chloe is a future leader and will be a senior at Minnetonka High School this coming fall. Chloe serves as a captain of the Minnetonka Congress team, which competes statewide with other schools debating legislative bills and policy. Lucy and John, before we jump into questions from our panel, I would like to ask each of you to spend 3 to 5 minutes to address this question. What defined your most successful efforts to build trust in policing and among criminal justice partners during your career? Lucy, again, thank you so much. We'll start with you, and then John will have you give your thoughts on that same question. Lucy, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel honored and privileged that I was asked to do this. And I am proud of the work I've been able to do in the community. And T, I recognize you from all of your work. I made some notes so I would stick to my 3 to 5 minutes. So my eyes may go to my notes here on my phone. But what I'm about to say that I think defines what I was successful at might sound like everything you know you learned in kindergarten.
Hmm.
So to start, it's relationships, relationships, relationships. Build relationships so people know you, know what they can expect, see you as a fellow human being, not just as a professional. It builds trust. Meant going to roll calls and staff meetings, attending neighborhood meetings, partnering on safety councils, co-chairing major collaborations with community members, having coffee before or grabbing lunch afterwards. Second, leading by example. You can't expect integrity, compassion, and respect if you don't have integrity, compassion, and respect. I did everything I expected from my personnel, even though as I rose in the ranks, some of the training I was no longer required to do. I went through every training, shot every weapon, got gassed, got tased, stood a post, worked long hours. I knew everyone by name. I attended every roll call and staff meeting regularly. I disciplined those who violated policy and procedures. I knew what was going on, and they knew that I knew. I delivered bad news when it was necessary. I didn't hand it off. I kept my word, and I celebrated successes. Third, inclusive leadership, getting input from those impacted by or with our work. I got input from all levels of personnel, from officers to captains to inspectors, for important decisions and changes, sworn and non-sworn. When it affected the community, I got community input. It empowers others, and they are more excited about and ready to implement the change they were part of creating. One big example was reducing crime in PV Park in South Minneapolis. I worked with over 50 partners, and it measurably reduced crime. And it was a really exciting thing to work with both community members and those who had been formerly incarcerated, as well as business people. Fourth, collaboration and problem solving. Working with all the county and social services and city departments at one point to solve entrenched problems in families and on blocks. So rather than just dealing with someone who had been arrested, what's going on in that home and that family? Meaning rather than working with them consecutively, one department after another, working with them concurrently to get at root causes. That meant housing inspections and repairs, employment and training, childcare, child protection, and support program for youth. Another one was the Phillips Partnership, which collaborated with businesses to improve safety in the neighborhood of Phillips. It involved Wells Fargo, Phillips Eye Clinic, Allina Health. It was huge infrastructure and safety improvements were made. And then last, defining expectations and holding people accountable. You can't have integrity without accountability. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucy. John?
Wow. Good job, Lucy.
Thanks, John.
And Lucy, feel free to jump in here. So I started with the Minneapolis Police Department in 1988. I worked the street. I was a detective. In 1999, I was elected Federation president, as Paul said. And in 2001, and this is where maybe you can help me out, Lucy, I don't remember what caused or what brought, we formed what was called the PCRC, the Police Community Relations Council. And we had a woman come in, a federal mediator.
There'd been one more shooting of a black man on the north side, which I think was the last straw. Yeah.
And so the federal mediator, along with the police department, met once a week at the Urban League, and for 2 years. And I was there as the union guy. And this was the community leaders. I mean, Ron Edwards, Clyde Bellacourt, Ian Bethel, Tim Anderson, and then the police department. So literally once a week for 2 years, we sat together and listened, because I will mirror what Lucy says, that life is about relationships. Relationships are about trust, about respect, and about communication. You don't always have to agree with each other, but listen. My new business cards have on there, be curious, not judgmental. So over the 2 years, it was such a learning experience, for not only for me to listen to the community members and their concerns, and we bring different people in from the police department to talk about how we do things, why we do things, but also for me to hear, their view of things. And over these 2 years, I mean, I developed lifelong relationships with these people. Ron Edwards, he had the Ron and Don show on North Minneapolis. I am the only Minneapolis police officer that he ever did his full hour show on, and it was good. And Ron and I, trust me, we had our differences, but we'd talk in the middle of the night, and we got along great. And that's where the trust came in. That was where the community relations came in. During the George Floyd riots, I was the commander of the North Side. I called a couple of community leaders that I've known for 30 years to say, hey, can you come by the 4th Precinct and help me? They showed up. We had Cub Store full of looters. One of the community members, a friend of mine, got some of the community people, because we were short, and we cleared out the Cub Store. So what defined me, I believe, with relationships was that working group for 2 years. And to me, looking back, it was really monumental. Today, when you hear of federal consent decrees and human rights investigations, we were doing that. We were doing that in 2001 before any of this. We were at opposite sides on some issues, so let's sit down and talk, have somebody there as a referee. And we came out with a signed document from every one of us with, I think it had 105 or 110 kind of things to do. And it was cool. It was to me, would have been career changing for policing in Minneapolis. And then, unfortunately, we got a new chief who wasn't part of the 2 years of the group, and he put it on a shelf somewhere, and it kind of went by the wayside. So, that was real sad to see, and they have since resurrected it. But it was about sitting down, talking, communicating, getting to know each other, and keeping dialogue. Back on the street, KG Wilson, how many times I used him to help me at situations that, they weren't happy with the police, but when I could stand with the community members they know and respected, it was great. It was unbelievable. And then as the union guy, I was never the union guy that defended every cop. I stood with the chief a number of times to say, no, what these cops did was wrong and they should be fired. I was all about clear expectations and consistent accountability. In the Minnesota human rights investigation that they did, and I was working the street and they rode with me several times, in the conclusion of that report, they actually say good things about the Federation and the Federation contract, and they put a lot of responsibility for the kind of bad accountability on the chief of police. I mean, the average time for a complaint to be investigated was 200 days. As a supervisor, I'd have to call you into my office and talk to you about something that happened 14 months ago. So, that was real hard for me because, when I was a shift lieutenant, every year we'd have a shift meeting where we'd lay out our expectations. So everybody knew what it was, and we consistently held people accountable. So that really kind of I was proud of my last 6 years on the North Side. But my defining moment was at Police Community Relations Council and the relationships that I to this day, I still talk to some of these people.
Well, thank you, John. I got to pass along to you. I spoke to my still very good friend, Joe Biernat, and he said people on the North Side loved you up there. So I just wanted to pass that along.
Thank you. I miss them.
Yeah, well, I don't, because I see them all the time. I'll pass that along. So what we're going to move to now are questions, and I'm going to call on each of our panelists for initial questions and maybe a little more free-flowing later on. But T, as the elder statesman, we'll call on you first. You have had firsthand experience with some of the kinds of work that Lucy and John were just talking about in terms of community building and law enforcement. And so I want to give you the first shot at a question about, your question about
thank you,
trust
Paul.
in law enforcement.
I want to make a brief comment and I want to thank Lucy and John for being with us this evening. They both were very consistent on several things, and one that I made note of is credibility. The credibility on their part, that they needed credibility, and then continuity is very important, and relationships. And without those elements there, it gets to be very challenging. So I would like to just ask the question here. This would be of both of them. How did you go about developing relationships in these communities where you were in communities often where you were highly suspect, where the people, many of the people in the community did not trust the police, and I can understand a lot of that. Most of the time that I was ombudsman, I was working in a community where there was a lack of trust, and you can't really do what you're there to do until you find some way to cut through all of that. So I'd be interested in hearing from either or both of you around what was most helpful to you in developing credibility and building relationships with people in the community, particularly the key leaders.
I can start. I feel really strongly about this. Show up, show up, show up, and show up again. And keep your word and go wherever you're invited. So when the Native American Safety Council wants me to come to their meetings, I go every week, no matter how long they are. And then I bring a lieutenant with me, and then I bring a sergeant with me, and they start developing the relationships. It doesn't just belong with me as the precinct commander. So it is carving out time for officers to be out of service and take an hour and connect with people in their district. So they're not just answering calls, but they get time to build relationships. And oftentimes I would take officers with me to do different things so they could see how it was done, because for them, it was a scary thing, to be honest with you. Their interactions with people are always on their worst day, whether they're a victim or being arrested, it's their worst day. And some officers are very good at it, but some others just need some coaching on how to interact with people. Take them along with you. So going to meetings, creating expectations that everyone that works with you will have some kind of community contact and build relationships, and then help them do it.
John?
No, and I agree wholeheartedly with Lucy. You know, when I was on the street, it was really important for cops to get to know the community outside of a crime scene. Because, you know, most street cops, their interactions with people is from a 911 call when they need the help. Nobody ever calls the police and says, hey, I'm having a good day, come over and have coffee. So that's really important. I think taking care of the cops that, you know, from call to call to call, you know, this job can wear on cops, and they become, I hate using the word calloused or hard, but, you know, when you start to lack empathy, and, you know, it can give the perception that, you know, they don't care, or we can't trust them, or, you know, they're not like, you know, they should be. So taking care of the cops is real important to me. Getting to know, I used to have community members come to my roll call. Hey, you know, you're around to some night, 8:15, come and talk to my cops. Some would last for 2 hours. Once they start talking, you know, and listening to each other, nobody wanted to leave. and people would leave there. But the other thing that I think is really important with policing is perception. And when you have the city council members standing up saying the police are bad, we want to defund them, we don't want to, support them. What do people think when your boss is out telling people they don't like you, would like to get rid of you? That to me can just set the stage for people to say, geez, if the city leaders say the cops aren't needed and are bad, they must be not needed and are bad. Because I think the people on the north side of the police on the north side have great relationships. They trust each other, they respect each other, they appreciate us. But some of that starts at the top.
Well,
thank you both.
John, you
let's
mentioned
T. I'm
something.
sorry, but I want to get a question for everybody, and then we'll have more of a free flowing discussion. So I'm just gonna sorry about that, but Janis, I'm gonna have you jump in, and then Chloe and Luka, and then we'll come back to you, T.
Okay, well, my question pretty much follows up on what you've been getting into, but everybody especially you two and Paul and T have such a many years of experience with the police and deep depth of knowledge. And the general public just doesn't have that. And going back to our theme of our interviews is restoring trust. The trust in the police is rather dependent on just their portrayal through the media, and as you were saying, John, through comments from leadership. How does that, first of all, do you think that does present much of an accurate portrayal, or what could be done to improve it, to deepen it for the general public who doesn't really interact with police a lot, but it's very important that they have trust?
To me, first of all, the media, the great things that the Minneapolis cops do every day, 24 hours a day, you hardly ever hear about. But one cop makes a mistake, does something stupid, something bad, it's on the front page of the paper. Unfortunately, one of the classes I taught was police in the media. And the media's theory is if it bleeds, it leads. People aren't interested in a nice story that the police and the community work together to solve problems. They'd rather have, the other stuff that comes with that. So, but perception can be reality. And how do you change that? I don't know, with the media.
So I
Lucy, do you have ways that you remember, I'm sorry, do you have ways, Lucy, that you tried to get those good stories out, in a position as a leader in the administration? What would you do to try to address the question Janis has raised? And
well, some of it goes back to relationships with reporters. And being responsive to them when they got a story that they're writing and they call you, talk to them. Even if it means I can only tell you one sentence, I can confirm, I can't confirm, but talk to them. Have a relationship within the bounds of, police reporter relationship. And then when you have a good story, they might take it for you. And so it goes back again to building relationships. I don't want to oversimplify what it's going to take to rebuild trust. We're in the culture of a low trust in many things. It's not just policing. It's going to be multiple levels and multiple fronts. And I would love someone to lead a strategic effort that would say, we're going to work with elected officials, so they're changing their language. We're going to work with the media so that they have some buy-in on how they're creating a misperception or perception of police. We're going to have police leaders. We're going to have as much transparency as possible and lay out what that means. I think you tell the community every week whatever you can tell them that happened that week. And as long as you're giving them information, then when you have to say, I can't share that, they'll trust you because you've been giving them information when you can. So this is media, this is elected officials, this is police leadership, this is other city departments, and then it's officer training and it's community involvement. And so that's not, that would take a long-term strategic effort. So we have to do in these little pockets where we have them, making some kind of effort every day.
Luka and Chloe, I want to turn to you, perhaps you first, Luka, and then Chloe. Your coming of age as very thoughtful young people, in an era that saw the murder of George Floyd and just all of the conversations around policing and obviously some of the more extreme defund police movements and some of just it's all been taken up to 11 on a scale of 10 while you yourselves are coming of age. And so I'm particularly curious your questions, informed by that experience that you have for John and Lucy. Now, Luka, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think my question is sort of more related to the theme of accountability. I guess just like a brief amount of context after the murder of George Floyd, the Minneapolis Police Department, there was increasing scrutiny on like the use of coaching. And more recently, there was the Board of Peace Officers Standards and Training, I think it was called. They suspended the license of a training company called Street Cop for their use of sort of training techniques. So I guess my question is more related to internal discipline and training of officers. Based on your experiences, what do you think are some changes need to be made? Do changes need to be made? And sort of what's the context behind that?
There's a multifaceted answer there. And I'll go back to leading by example and laying out expectations and holding people accountable. And we don't need more training. We don't need more policies to enforce. We need to train to what we have, and we need to enforce the policies that we do. And it's too easy to say add more when the real answer is to enforce what we have. I think it requires courage from leaders, including chiefs all the way down to sergeants, who are willing, who are trained in it, to say, this was wrong, and you're going to have discipline, and you're not going to, I'm trying to do this too quickly. It's about clear expectations, clear consequences of what's going to happen when those expectations are broken, and then leaders with the courage to hold people accountable. I'll give you an example. I would hear, when I was in the 3rd precinct, there was 140 personnel. And I'd occasionally hear, a sergeant grumble about cops, and I would say, what are you doing with them? And check on how they're doing. And then I would read every one of those performance appraisals. I don't think anybody else did that, but I read 140 performance appraisals. And when I would see a positive review on someone they'd been complaining about, I sent it back to them and said, I want to see in that, and I want the officer to hear what's not going well and what you're going to do to improve that performance. That's the kind of leadership you have to have. And I don't think we do a good job of training and developing leaders in policing. We don't. That doesn't sound very promising, but I think it's a training and leadership development issue. And we need to pay attention to that and acknowledge that we could do better on it.
John?
And I think a big thing in accountability is you can't wait months or years to correct bad behavior. I believe discipline should be not punishment, but to correct bad behavior. So if a complaint gets filed about a cop, say today, what's a reasonable amount of time for it to be investigated and sitting on a supervisor's desk to bring the cop in to deal with it? I mean, when the average is 200 days, I mean, it's like your kids or your dog, if they misbehave, you don't wait 200 days to correct them with it. And, so that to me is, one of the biggest things, consistency. What else would happen is one cop would do one thing in one precinct and get 2 days off. Another cop would do the same thing in another precinct and get no time off. Well, you can't have that. And then that's when the union would say, hey, we're not telling you what to do, but you got to be consistent.
Yeah.
And you need supervisors, like Lucy said, the right training. And I can say this now because I've been retired, to make a point, 2 years, I got all my cops' performance reviews done by my sergeants. and I corrected them, and we had interviews. But I held on to them because I wanted to see who in the city would review them. Nobody ever asked for them. 2 years, 80 cops, no one above me ever wanted to know how were their performance reviews. And then with discipline, I had 2 cops that screwed up big time on a domestic. Called them in, we reviewed the body cameras, whatever. So it came down, they were each going to get a 20-hour suspension. That's $1,000. So I called downtown and said, hey, what if I make these cops spend 2 days in the domestic abuse service center? Get paid, but you're going to see what your screwing up did and how it affects people that are getting help. Because, this is kind of like educational discipline. You punish somebody by giving them a fine. That doesn't make, all they do is get mad. But I'm thinking, okay, these 2 guys got to go spend 20 hours in this domestic service center dealing with the victims on that end of it. And the department said, no, give them their time off. And then the last thing is civilian review boards. The Federation has been involved from the very inception of the first one with every remake of the civilian review board. We have worked, we have had our disagreements, but we've always worked with them, and in the end, kind of, worked with what we got. And for some reason, and I don't have the answer to that, that's probably a whole nother guest speakers and a whole nother stream of sessions. How do you figure that out? Because if you never get answers, and like Lucy said, I think the department does a poor job of what they talk about, what they don't talk about. But you got to have transparency, and people have to have the trust that the chief. I don't think you need consent decrees. None of them have ever worked. I think you need a chief. We need a council and a mayor to hire the right chief. Need the right chief to lay out the expectations, consistent accountability, and hold the supervisors accountable. And if that works, that's huge on building what we're talking about, trust back with the community.
I'd like to add one thing that for me is kind of overarching on this subject, and that is that we're not this divided, but to make my point, I'm going to say we have the community and we have the police. And we both sides forget the humanity of the other. Cops want to be seen as humans who might make mistakes, who have kids and dogs and partners and ailing parents and children that are ill. And the community wants to be seen as humans who are ailing and hurting and have problems they want the police to solve. And they know the cops aren't perfect, but please work with us. And I mean, just sitting down with that kind of a perspective of each other's humanity to work together, be forgiving, and not come to the table and fight about what we did in the past. That's what I want to see, where that coming together and say, okay, where can we go from here?
So empathy, a big part of leadership.
Pardon?
Empathy
Yes.
becomes very important.
Yes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Chloe?
And I think it's
go
important
ahead.
to take care of the cops so they don't lose that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been really cool listening about kind of the steps you've already been taking in terms of restoring trust for policing. A lot of the accountability, connection, that's all been super cool to listen about. I think my question is more kind of geared towards the future. Obviously, the world is ever changing. Media outlets are changing from newspapers to social media. Technology is getting more and more advanced. I think my question for you both would be, how do you see kind of policing looking different in the future? And is there anything you want to see it shift towards in the future too?
Great question.
I would say one of the biggest shifts for me would be really hiring towards the guardian versus the warrior mentality, where officers come to the job. And I think most of them did or do. We did. I think John did. I think I did to really protect and serve. And the job there requires some other things that can harden you. And some of the hardest things, I'm going to go off on too many tangents. One of the things I would love to see is carve out a piece of geography, Minneapolis, anywhere, and say, we're going to start a new police department with the best model and best practice. We'd hire a chief that had the vision for that. They could select their leadership and personnel and would hire cops for that with very clear expectations that would be more around the guardian mentality. The training would train to that. The accountability would be laid out, and it would be trying to create a new culture and a new way of policing, starting over, not trying to change a current culture. That's one thing. And then really looking at what has policing become and what do we need it to be. And I think we're in a non-strategic way trying to do that with talking about having social services doing some of the response to emergency calls like mental health and other kinds of things, and homelessness, rather than a police response. I think the idea is right. I'm not sure the solution is right. So looking at what do you actually need a gun and a badge to do? What are those things you want? Who else can do the rest of the job? And then how do we train officers to be in that role that we only need them for, and maintaining their compassion and humanity in doing it?
Great. John?
And, and I think an important thing is how do you move forward in, the whole discipline process as education discipline, a way of the future. One of the things in the civilian review process we used to have was the cops and the citizens could both agree to mediation, where literally they would go in a room together with a mediator and listen to each other.
Yeah.
And I want to say it was 85 to 90%, both the community members and the cops said it was successful. Think about this. You took two people that, were at odds over what happened and put them in a room and let them talk and get to know each other and listen to each other. To get any group of people to agree with something with 85 or 90% is huge to me. But it's that, and then like Lucy said, I co-taught police ethics. And this was granted a while ago, but in a 4-year college degree, you had all this officer survival training. And you need it, don't get me wrong. But one ethics class. And my speech used to be, more cops will get fired for doing unethical, stupid stuff than getting killed in the line of duty. So where is the balance? I think education is important. I think Minnesota has always been on the forefront of the first state to have college, but it's the right training.
And Chloe, I would like to piggyback on something John said. In terms of the vision of the future, I think it's more restorative, more healing, more educational, rather than trying to punish, trying to learn and grow, whether that's in our incarceration system, whether that's in policing, but a much more restorative model and healing model than a punitive one.
T, I'm going to bring things back to you. Oh, T, I think you're on mute. I think T, you're on mute. How do we get T's volume up?
You start something and then you don't stick with it long enough to see if it's going to work, or you there's no fidelity to it. Now, so that when there's a change in leadership at the top or wherever it is, if they don't particularly like what's going on, then it gets stopped and someone else comes in, you have to start it all over again. So each time you do that, you've got to work on your credibility side of that. So that, to me, that has to be very challenging. Then the other question I have is, how is supervision practiced in the police department? Is there ever a time that you schedule some time aside, say if no more than a half an hour, where you're one-on-one with the person whom you're supervising, that person brings to you some of her issues and concerns, and you have some things that you want to talk to the officer about, so that so that there is that opportunity of dedicated time for each officer, in addition to the ongoing observation and supervision that takes place on the job. But it seems to me there needs to be some dedicated alone time for supervision. Is that built into the workday for the officer and her or his supervisor?
I'll go first, Lucy. First of all, I so agree with your first comment. I was on the police department for 34 years. I had 4 mayors, 12 police chiefs. Okay. So, yeah, when one starts a project and they're not there to follow through, and then things change, then the message change, then the training changes. So that's a great point. And how do you, like my PCRC back in 2001 to 3, it was a great thing. It disappeared because we changed administrators. What did we lose in that time? So I so agree with that. And as far as connecting with the cops, Resma on the north side, I went to training, 2 of his training sessions for the police department. And it was resiliency training, and it was how to identify your people that work for you when something's going on to deal with it. It was probably the best training I've ever had, ever as a cop, ever as a supervisor. And unfortunately, they didn't find it in the budget to hire him to train the whole police department. But it was kind of like you said. So if you notice one of your people that work for you is acting different, you bring them in on one-on-one. I had an open door policy. All my cops knew they could come to me and talk to me as the lieutenant. But yeah, could you have scheduled one-on-ones? I think like when Lucy was an inspector, I think she can answer this, had one-on-ones with their people. I did with my sergeants once a month. But I don't know what happens now, but that's something that they could start at the top to really be the whole department. So everything's the same. Consistency is really important because like you said, not just with the chiefs, but you can be an officer or a sergeant in one precinct today and have things be run in one way, and tomorrow you're at a different precinct and it's totally different.
I think something that's really important to do that covers I think a number of these questions is that police departments, with the support of elected officials, have to be able to set priorities with community input and officer input and say, these are our priorities. Everybody agrees that this is how we're going to operate, get buy-in, and then be able to move forward. So let's say there's 6 things. Someone comes along with number 7. What happens today? They say, oh, we'll do that. Number 8 comes along. Oh, we'll do that. And so what you have then is all these things you committed to, like one-on-one time with an officer, goes out the window because you've just said yes to 7, 8, and 9. What if you said, no, we're just going to do these 6 things. Everybody agrees. Those are our priorities. And we get to say no to the rest. That's one of the hardest problems, is being able to say no when you know you don't have the resources and it's a lower priority and everybody's agreed to that. That's a tough thing. So I think universal agreement in a jurisdiction, a town, a city, to what the priorities are, and let the leaders lead to those priorities.
Great. So I guess I'll jump in, even though I'm the moderator. One of the things that strikes me from the conversation that's so challenging is I myself have been a critic of the lack of transparency, and Luka mentioned coaching, and we have this dilemma, and John, I'd love for you to respond to this, because I put myself in the position of a police administration in a city like Minneapolis right now. And as we talked about the fact that only the bad stuff gets press, right, John and Lucy, both, you said that. And so there's almost an understandable at a certain level inclination just to hide the bad stuff, just because,
yeah.
And I understand it at a certain level, but then as somebody who thinks we have to have transparency for trust, I push back on it. So, how is it ever in the interest of, whether a law enforcement leader or a union president, how is it ever in the interest to have transparency where bad conduct sees the light of day? How and how might we manage that better if there was more transparency in terms of misconduct? How might we manage that in such a way that it doesn't even further taint the image of all the good law enforcement officers?
And
I don't
go ahead,
Go ahead,
Lucy.
John.
Go ahead, John.
Either way. Okay.
So, first of all, body cameras. Body cameras have really, I supported them. I believe in them. They've helped policing in complaints to the sense of videos don't lie. There's now coming people that, what you see sitting in your chair watching it 2 days later is different than what was going through the officer's mind in the split-second decision they made it. But so those have been a big help. But as far as, transparency, a big issue that I see in kind of the whole discipline trust issue is force is ugly. Force is ugly. But think of the cops have the authority to take a human life if it warrants it. That's not pretty. Somebody resisting arrest, somebody overdosing on drugs, when it's a physical fight, it's not pretty. So that's on a videotape, or cops do something that somebody perceives as wrong or thinks is wrong that really is in policy, how they were handcuffed, how they were transported. So it goes through the complaint process. And some people I know, you arrested me, I'm going to file a complaint against you every week to get you fired. So when they, investigate the complaint and it's unfounded or non-sustained, that's kind of where coaching came to be. It's still there on your file. It's still there on your file forever for somebody to say, oh, look at John Delmonico has 12 complaints. And maybe 10 of them were all, justified what I was doing. So there's that piece of, how do you sort that out? And then also for a police chief, and like Lucy said earlier, when a cop does something stupid, and it's something you think, do they deserve a second chance? So the chief's got to balance if I bring them back and they screw up, it's going to be on them. If I bring them back and they are a success story, I know cops that have been fired and come back and been better cops. I know cops that have been fired and come back and still be bad cops. So that's a juggling act. But I think, moving forward, you gotta, and even like the civilian review, there's people, I believe that no matter what happens, they won't believe anything but what they want to believe.
Yeah. Lucy?
I think one of the issues is what I just take up the civilian review, because that has been popularized in many different forms, and there's new iterations coming along all the time. One of the fears of cops is that it's going to be punitive people that don't understand policing, and the community is afraid that the civilians they put on won't be tough enough. And so if you get people that are perceived as anti-cop on a civilian review process, or whatever you want to call it, cops don't trust it. And so we've got a long way to go on getting some kind of civilian oversight. And again, it's with a methodical, trusting process, I think we could get there to something everyone trusted. And then back to your original question, which was about, I just lost it.
Future.
Oh, it was media.
Well, I think my question had to do with why, kind of an understanding as to why someone leading a department would want to keep things quiet, would not want the public, just because of the impact of negative media and maybe the unfairness of tainting the entire department and those perhaps perverse incentives, almost encouraging.
But I've seen it work in actually the opposite of that. And it starts with, I was working with a smaller department in Minneapolis on some reform. And one of the things the chief started doing was just putting out the chief's report every 2 weeks. and it included traffic stops and domestic violence and arrests and by race. And suddenly people who thought there was a race problem realized that a lot of white people were getting arrested and stopped. And it started to build trust in a way that was unexpected when people saw that the department wasn't what they thought it was. They also learned there was a lot more problems and crime in their town than they wanted to believe. And just telling the community every 2 weeks what you had done went a long way to changing how people saw the police. Number one, just because they told them the clicks and the readership was down because everybody realized that they were being told what's going on, and suddenly they didn't care as much because they felt the transparency. I think you get that kind of trust from reporting what you can report, and then you start adding maybe personnel issues, not names, but numbers. Complaints received, complaints unfounded, discipline, and just generally report. And also, along with that, commendations, recognition, thank you letters, a number of contacts, positive appreciation from the community. You just put it all out there. And I think that there's you build trust by being transparent. And I'm not sure there's a disincentive because complaints have, actually in this town, some high school kids said something's changed in town because I think something's changed in town. There must be better management. They had no idea kind of what had changed, but they could feel it. So I think you can be transparent. You have to be careful about how you do it. And there is an incentive to do it. I think it's trust. That's the incentive.
And I agree with Lucy. I don't think there's any incentive to hide anything, and that they should be more transparent. That can bring more issues with it.
So good leaders know that transparency brings trust, is what you're saying.
And it was interesting for one of my college papers. I wrote a paper on it. And I wish I could remember the numbers of discipline for a year. How many cops had been fired? You know, how many were arbitrated? How many? And people didn't believe me with the numbers because every one of them doesn't make the paper. I mean, the chief, you know, I looked up on how many people were terminated, how many, and that's another thing too, that, you know, I don't know that you want a weekly chart, but the chiefs all need to be able to stand up and say, I am laying out my expectations. I am holding people accountable, because I don't think a lot of people, you know, they don't hear not just the good, but the job a chief is doing and holding people accountable.
So Luka and Chloe, I'm putting you on the spot for a moment here. Maybe you've never had any contact with law enforcement of any kind, but either yourself or other folks. I'm just curious, you know, your perceptions and any questions that might come from actual personal experiences. You can throw, Janis, if you had a speeding ticket, you can throw yourself into the mix too. But are there any questions that you would have from maybe personal experiences you've had with law enforcement for either Lucy or John?
I guess for me, I definitely don't have as much experience and kind of connection with police departments as I know Paul or T, both of you have. I think in my head and a lot of the heads of kind of high school students especially, we see police as kind of people who give us speeding tickets or people who are kind of hiding on the side of the road. I think the question I had related to that would be, what are some ways that police departments are reaching out to youth, and what are some ways that they could start reaching out more effectively or almost in a better way to get a kind of head start in that kind of connection and trust building piece?
It's your question about reaching out related to traffic stops. I'm not sure I heard clearly what your question is.
I think I heard it more generally is forgive me, Chloe, but as how might, and I think it's a great question, how might law enforcement reach out and develop relationships with young people like Chloe, like Luka, to build a generation that has relationships with and sees them, forgive me, Chloe, you know, as more than just someone that's going to give them a ticket.
All right, so I'll give you a couple examples that I know about. One high school has worked with the police department. Instead of having necessarily a school resource officer, they have an officer that comes to the door, stands at the main entrance, and then changes entrances depending on where kids are coming in, and just greets students every day. And then, this is Brad Sacco, he gets in line at the lunch line and he serves kids their lunch. And he wears an apron that says, "It's not me, it's Tina." Meaning if the kids don't like the lunch, Tina's the cook, so don't blame him. So there's humor in it, and just serving lunch. That is one thing, and it's very simple. And it's whether it's coming in to civics classes and talking about policing and taking questions. I mean, it's exposing kids to officers as humans. There was recently a story about a young Black kid who was selling things in his yard, and neighbors complained that he was selling things without a permit. So the cops arrived, they bought things from the kid, and then helped him get a permit to do what he was doing. Those are the kinds of things that you can do. You have to seek them out, but John and I both know Joey Sandberg and other officers that worked in the schools for years and maybe after school, and they were great partners with the kids, and they were beloved because they interacted with them as human beings. So I think getting them into schools in any way you can.
And that's a two-way street. I have a niece who's a school teacher in the Minneapolis school system, and every year she taught middle school. I would go speak at her class at least once or twice and have lunch with the kids. And she would talk for months afterwards how the impact that had kids seeing the human side of a cop, much less her uncle. So I agree with Lucy. And, if you look at the Addams family and coaching at North High, that there's a Showtime series, Boys of Blue. Here's an MTC cop, some Minneapolis cops. They recruited one of the guy who was the barber, who's now a cop. But what they did, if you watch it, these guys, what they did to the community is unbelievable, unbelievable. And Chloe, just so you know, I was a cop for 34 years and never wrote one speeding ticket because I couldn't be a hypocrite because I sped. So you and I would have never met. But cops need to get out there. And, but like in Minneapolis, when George Floyd, let's kick the cops out of the schools. Let's kick the cops out of the parks. And that would have been the time let's find good cops and get them in the schools. So in like Lucy said, I go back to, the Edison cop, the guy that was at Edison for years. Everybody knew him, even long after they left school. So again, that's a two-way street, and it's a great idea because most people don't have interaction with the cops. I mean, unless they're, needing something that isn't pleasant.
So I think T has probably a good anecdote for us and a question as well. And I also want to give you an opportunity, T, to talk about give a quick plug on your book as well. But go ahead, T.
What I want to comment on is the value of building relationships in the community with community individuals and with institutions, because I think we have unrealistic expectations from the police about what it is that they can do or should be doing. That their police are reactive is so very much as after something has happened that they are called, that they can't stop it at that point because it has already happened. So I don't see their role is to try to prevent that through their activity, but they can work by working in partnership with the community, particularly with community institutions. They can be effective and not so much of finding ways where the police gets the credit for it, but where the community gets the credit for helping to bring about those changes. I see our community institutions as being critical, and I think it's important if we have our police engaged in partnership with us in many of those institutions, and they know and understand what the roles of those institutions are in the community, so that these are places that the police often can go to when they need assistance with dealing with critical issues in the community. That's so important, and that's part of what some of the officers have been doing historically in building those relationships. The Adams family, working with North High, and that my son made that movie, I'm trying to remember what you call the movie with the team. There were two made, one by one of the outfits with a lot of money, and my son Jeff Williams made the one that Forces in Blue, that focused on the Adams family and other police officers coaching the team. In fact, all of the coaches over in North High were connected with the police department, and so it's building those kinds of relationships that are very important. In fact, most of my professional life has been working through communities and dealing with issues, whether it's the church or the nonprofit communities in particular, and that's what I write about in the book, most of it. But I think that if we can strengthen the relationship between the police force and the community, it's our best bet. This whole notion of community policing, I don't think we've ever given it our best shot. If we could give it our best shot, I think that we could make strides in law enforcement.
So if I could follow up with what T said there, there's obviously a lot of discussion now about the historically low numbers in the police department. Meanwhile, we have what are called violence interrupters. We have a $23 million new Department of Public Safety, which is not actually officers, but other individuals. And yet we don't have a lot of beat cops anymore. We don't have cops on bikes. We don't have the number of safe officers we had. Sorry if I'm giving a political speech here. I probably shouldn't be doing that. But I'm wondering what your take is on that. It just seems as though, and Lucy, you were a leader with community policing, but it seems that with cutting law enforcement budgets, we're cutting away, aren't we? The very things that you and John as well worked on. It's community policing that's actually going away because all we have money for are the 911 officers. And what does that do to creating the kind of trust you're talking about? If all we're left with are 911 responders, what does that do to the things that both of you are talking about in terms of building trust?
Well, I'd comment on that. This goes back to my talking about having agreed upon priorities. And one of those priorities is police and community contact. Let's just say that's one of them. And then when someone says, no, we're going to do number 7, and you say, well, then you're going to give up police community contact. Well, no, that's our priority. We're going to stick with it. So that's what I think. It's really important to set priorities within whatever resources you have. And then you always say no to the next thing so you can do that. And that's what it takes, the will of everyone to do that. Then I think within the role you have in enforcement, you could use every one of those opportunities to build a relationship. You make a traffic stop, you give them a warning, and you say, now look, you know why we make traffic stops? We want you to be safe. We want the community to be safe. Maybe you weren't aware of the lane, but use it as a connecting opportunity. It's still enforcement. You give them a warning and you connect. When you have a victim, maybe you spend a few extra minutes with the victim after maybe the perpetrator's arrested. But you got to find those moments in the line of duty when you're short of resources, and you have to protect your priorities.
And to me, I mean, first of all, I commend you and wish we all had an answer for, why policing is so short of help across the country. I do think a big part of it is support from leaders. But then sticking with Minneapolis, if you look back in Lucy, when did you start SAFE?
In that mid-'80s.
Okay, so we're talking 40 some years ago when, the cops then were, kick ass and take names. Lucy Gerold shows up in town as a non-cop, starts community crime prevention with Chief Boza and Mayor Frazier. where she started the SAFE program, which, for those of you that don't know what it was, is where they partnered a uniformed police officer with a crime prevention specialist that were assigned to the specific neighborhoods. Okay. So you can only imagine, and I came on in '88, so I was, it had been around a while. And some of these old cops, it's like, oh, this is, another program. And I tell you what, as cops started to do this and see the relationships that were built as a street cop, the SAFE team would keep me informed of what's going on. I could communicate things with them. There was cops lined up to want to be in these programs. Departments across the country mirrored what Lucy started here with but it was where cops and a civilian got to know the community and were kind of the go-between between, like T said, when they're not going call to call, to sit down, go to community meetings, get to know people, be the face, the same face. And they eliminated it. And to me, there's, I have my personal feelings on that whole civilian violence interrupter programs, and it's what measurable outcomes are there, because I haven't seen any for the amount of money that's being spent. And then with my cop hat on, it's what you could do with policing if you had that money to be able to put beat cops back on. Think of if you had cops walking the Broadway beat, if you had cops on East Hennepin and Hennepin Avenue beat, Lake Street beat. But that SAFE team, what Lucy did, is unbelievable. And just for being funny now, if you can ever look up one of Tony Bose's first books, there's a picture with Lucy with the mayor and McGruff, the crime dog. But Lucy I think she still had her hair from the 70s, but it's quite the picture of Lucy.
We're going to find that one and put it up on the website. Luka, can you work on that?
Please do.
Luka and Janis, I want to give you one more shot, and then maybe we'll give Lucy and John a chance for any final comments. But do either of you have any last questions for our guests?
I was going to say we had the pleasure of interviewing Tony Boza not too many years ago, and he was really something. So yes. Well, anyway, my question, we've touched on a lot of things, like, for example, the SAFE program, but is there anything else? I mean, I hope we get a lot of viewers looking at this interview and people learn something. Anything else either of you want to pull out that we haven't touched on that people should know about from the past? Or, both of you have had such interesting backgrounds in addition to the policing. So, just anything we haven't touched on that you think is valuable that we should have.
I'd like to add one thing, and it comes from my nephew's experience. He's had positive and negative experience with cops. Of course, growing up with me, he thought cops were really cool, honorable. And then he lives 3 blocks from the 3rd precinct. And so he saw a lot of the rioting. After George Floyd was murdered, he saw the burning, and it was really stressful, traumatic for him. Fast forward, he was stopped by, he was sideswiped by a drunk driver in Minneapolis in the past months. And he said the cops' response was great. They were really kind, they were compassionate, they were really helpful. And he had a positive experience. And then he saw on the phone cover of one of the officers, and on her wrist was a thin blue line bracelet and a thin blue line on her phone cover. And that sends a different kind of message, that it's us and them. And then on another officer that showed up just to make sure everything was okay, he saw, do you know what the Punisher is? A Marvel comic bad villain, the Punisher skull.
Chloe knows.
And well, he was wearing some small emblem of the Punisher, picture, a skull. And again, you can have the right actions, but if you've got these cultural negative symbols, you got to be aware of those and keep them off cops when they're in uniform. I think when they're in uniform and they're working, we get to decide what they wear. And let's keep it clean. We don't need to send a mixed message.
So, and John, I'd love to have you comment on this because this wasn't true when you and I worked together, but there's been such a partisanship almost that's happened, quite honestly, where um, there's this perception anyway that law enforcement's lean one way politically, and elected officials in Minneapolis and others, um, and I know, Lucy, you've done work with Braver Angels and trying to address that, but how is that kind of partisanship and ideological clash that I do think is different than when you and I worked together? What has that done in your view, and how do we overcome that?
John, why don't you take this? Why don't you take
either one of you can take it.
No, and it's a great question. And, it goes back to my comments about, the police when you, the issue of law and order, it's become a partisan issue because they feel they're not supported by the progressive side. Okay. They don't want jail terms. They don't want, accountability. They want to get rid of the police. So that to me is, the hardest thing. And some of it I agree with. Some of it is too much. There's homeless, there's mental health, there's addiction issues, but there are people that commit crimes that need to be locked up. I think the prison system needs a bunch of work to how do we help people in prison, different discussion. Mm-hmm. But, the cop mentality is law and order. And, and so it's hard to see. I mean, literally, I don't know if you saw on TV the other day, some kids in a stolen car were doing crazy things in front of the cops, and the cops just had to sit there. Yeah. Or, in my analogy, and I'm not saying I promote this, but in 1979, it was legal for a cop to shoot at a fleeing felon, i.e. a stolen car. Okay? Now today, or when I was a cop, you'd arrest somebody. By the time you got done with your paperwork, that person's out of jail. So it is, it's a partisan issue because of, law and order. And to me, my big thing has always been, we need the police, but we need good police. And how do we for the younger people here, my advice is keep the conversations going, get people to the table to talk. I would love to see, the Democratic Party, Paul, you were a big, big supporter of the police and fire and public safety and plowing the streets. You knew my family. My family had a business in Northeast for 80 years. Michael Rainville, he still is, that belief, and yet you can still be a good, great person to help people. The Democrats do. It's not, one or the other, but there's got to be the happy medium of having good police. But police, because the number one thing I hear from people in Minneapolis all the time is they don't feel safe coming downtown. And how do you fix that? You go, they were advertising in the paper, it's been how long since they had a murder, and then 6 people get shot over the weekend. Well, so I don't know. I think it is an issue. I think it's a real issue. And that comes back to cops feeling supported.
And it's doing what we're doing here tonight, which is the hard work of these conversations. And we're probably about at the end of that great conversation. But, this has been a really great one about how we keep conversations going, open dialogue. That's how we build trust, whether it's in policing or any of the other institutions that we have. And so, John or Lucy, any last comments before T? Did you have one last comment you wanted to make maybe before we turn it over to Lucy and John for their final comments?
One thing I want to say is that when we start these many different programs and change efforts around the police and many other things, we really don't take a critical look at our history and some of what we have done in those areas over time, and what of that worked and what did not work. What we do is we start off as it's the first time we have dealt with these issues,
Yeah.
and we start with something that's totally unrelated to what is likely to be effective, because we don't pay attention to what enough attention to what we did, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and how much of that worked. Let's pull those pieces out that worked with us. That's particularly in relation to community policing, that we just throw that out the window. We don't look at what we had some stuff that we did back then that really worked.
Yeah.
Why look at that and pull that forward?
Yeah.
That's a great point, and Lucy and John, that's really what our Civic Caucus group is about. We feel like Minnesota has a proud tradition of civic innovation. Minneapolis has a proud tradition of a lot of civic innovation. The two of you were involved in it. Lucy, you were one of the pioneers of community policing. So that's exactly the work that TU did with the Urban Coalition. That was pioneering work nationally. So what a waste if we don't learn from the past and engage with the future, Chloe and Luka. That's why you're here too. So we want to extend our thanks and give the two of you the final word, Lucy and then John, and then we'll thank you and let you be on your way.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Despite all the tough issues we've talked about tonight, I am hopeful. I'm optimistic. If you look back, and he's talking about history here, we have come a long way. If you think things are rough, and they are, we've come a long way. Things are different. Things are better. We have more accountability. There's many things in our history that we're not doing anymore that we are grateful that we're not doing. And I'm looking towards the future with more healing, more reconciliation, really being grateful and honoring cops and their successes, not just focusing on the negative, developing leadership that's really accountable. And I really have hope for the future, because that's what we want. All of us want safe communities with working with people that are going to be on the same page, on common ground for safety. And how can we do that together? And I have hope that we'll get there.
Thanks, Lucy. John?
I'm with Lucy. I have hope for the future. My advice is, and one of the things I've always lived by, be at the table and be part of the solution. Don't stand in the back of the room and bitch about the problem, because that's how you get things done. And don't give up hope, because you look back when I started as a cop in 1988, and fast forward 30 some years, policing is better. Cops are better. How things are done is better. So, you've come a long way, and T hit the nail on the head. We can't forget all the work of all the people have done and the great things that over the years that have been accomplished. Like, you're ever looking for new people for your series, I'd bring in Sharon Sales Belton. She was, to me, one of the best mayors the city ever had. She dealt with, Minneapolis was labeled Murderapolis. So you talk about a history and perspective of somebody in the city would be her. And to the young people, don't ever give up talking. If you're in an opportunity to get to know a cop, have them come speak at your group, a Q&A, anything. Get to know them, understand them, and figure out how together everybody can foster great policing and keeping community safe.
Well, thank you both so very, very much. And for those who are watching us, we hope you join us for our next interview as well on May 27th with Peter Hutchinson. Keep these conversations going. Lucy and John, thank you so much, not only for being here, but for your public service. Thanks to our panelists, and we wish everybody a great evening. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.